The year 2021 was a strange time for anyone whose main job was working in an office. By the summer, we had all been working from home for over a year, and opinions were mixed. Some loved it, others less so. When we got the news that we would have to return to the office in the fall once restrictions were lifted, it caused similar controversy. Some couldn't wait to get back to the office, while others threatened to quit if they were pressured to do so. Well, things came to a head, and many people were laid off, and all of that was terrible. We lost some good team members, and that meant one of the first tasks when we returned to the office was to hire several new employees to fill the gaps. But that proved much easier said than done. First, we tried to replace all our lost team members with equally qualified staff, but due to the precarious financial situation we were in, we couldn't meet the salary demands of many applicants. But we needed team members, and we needed them fast. So we started offering interviews to candidates who weren't as qualified as some of the people on our wish list, but were still technically qualified to fill the gaps in our company. And one of those candidates was a woman I'll call Tanya. I call her Tanya because my daughter is obsessed with the movie I, Tanya, and that's the first name that pops into my head right now while I'm looking for a fake name. I don't want to use Tanya's real name for obvious reasons. I imagine everyone does things in life they later regret, and although I spent a while hating her, I've reached the point where I genuinely wish her well and hope she resolves the issues she was struggling with at that time. Anyway, we hired Tanya as a customer service representative, and although that's definitely not the easiest job in the world, we found out pretty quickly that she wasn't cut out for customer service. It was also incredibly confusing because she had applied well, and at least one of her references was good. The only problem was that she had never worked in customer service, and although hiring her to lead our only customer service representative was technically a risky move, I and the CEO didn't think there would be an issue. We rushed to hire her, and since I was busy talking to our other potential employees, I failed to check her other two references. And if I had, they might have told me that Tanya excelled at almost everything except conflict resolution. She was punctual, her attitude was largely great, but when things got a little tense with a complaining customer, she sometimes just saw red. I suppose the first time this happened, we just let it slide. Tanya was so great in all other areas that we didn't want to let her go without first trying a gentle approach. We took her aside to talk a little and basically said she shouldn't take things so personally. Every now and then she would deal with rude people, and the trick was to turn off the emotions, detach, and pretend everything was simply an elaborate problem-solving exercise, like a Rubik's Cube, except the cube is a total jerk the whole time. You wouldn't call the cube a jerk, would you? You just take a deep breath and try a different approach. I remember the CEO basically saying we thought she was better than that we thought she was an incredible employee, and it wasn't unrealistic to expect better from her. Of course, she couldn't just refuse service to a customer, but we reminded her that she had the right to end the conversation and suggest the person's name for the blacklist if a customer truly became abusive, not just impatient or in a bad mood. She wasn't a punching bag, and we wouldn't let her be one. But at the same time, she needed to try to keep a cool head when dealing with customers, so we could separate the ill-tempered ones from the monstrous ones, and we would support her in that. Again, she agreed, thanked us for the feedback, and we ended the meeting on a very positive note. Cut to about 2 or 3 weeks later, and Tanya is once again in a shouting match with a customer on the phone, and the CEO asks me to give her an ultimatum: do whatever is necessary to avoid conflict with customers or be asked to leave, which was, of course, the polite and friendly way of saying she would be fired. I wasn't strictly in HR at the time. I was involved in hiring, but not in any official capacity. But instead of going to HR and hopefully ending any potential conflict, the CEO asked me to give Tanya one last chance before things became very official and we were forced to fire her. I don't think it was a mistake to ask me to do it, but I know for sure that I made a mistake in the execution. You see, when you have a serious conversation with an employee, a third party should be present to act as a witness, so that in the event of an outburst, someone can confirm whether or not you said a particular thing. Now, 99% of the time, the witness is only there for formalities, but sometimes something happens that demonstrates exactly why such systems are implemented in the first place. I assumed that because Tanya, the CEO, and I had had a little heart-to-heart and it had gone well, it would be okay to just privately grab her in a free moment to give her this final warning. Apart from the craziness with the customers, she was absolutely polite and reasonable to all her colleagues, including me, so I had no real reason to think she would react truly negatively. But I was wrong. So, the next afternoon, following the CEO's request, I was between tasks when I saw Tanya heading back to the storage room. I thought it was as good a time as any to talk to her about her approach to handling customer complaints. So I walked behind her, said hello, and then asked if we could talk briefly. Tanya said yes, and then I cautiously began to address the complaint situation. She listened for a few minutes and seemed to take everything I said into account, until I mentioned the possibility that she might be fired. First, she seemed to get a little nervous. Then, as I continued talking about the possibility of being fired, I could see her becoming a little emotional. I stopped speaking for a moment, asked if everything was okay, and she responded by taking a step back before turning toward one of the storage shelves. At this point, I was a little nervous. I mean, just like anyone else would be when the person you're talking to simply steps back and then turns away from you. My first thought was that it was somehow, I don't know, a way to calm down, that stepping back and turning around was her way of detaching and regaining composure. I asked again if everything was okay, but she didn't say anything again. Instead, she leaned back a little, then she threw her head forward and struck her face against the metal support of the shelf, that is, the posts on each side of a shelf that hold the actual shelves. At first, I was so shocked that I didn't react. Honestly, I just stood there, completely taken by surprise, until she did it a second time. And that second impact was what made the blood squirt from her nose like from a faucet. I stepped forward and tried to hold her to stop her from hurting herself further, but she let out this screechy scream, yelling, "Let me go! Help me! Help me!" I remember being so startled that I backed away from her, and as soon as she had enough space, she walked past me, opened the door to the main office, and stumbled in, sobbing, "Help me! Someone's gone crazy!" As far as I can recall, I will never forget that moment when I realized what Tanya was trying to do. She hadn't just gotten scared. She had had an emotional breakdown, and then she hit her head against a shelf, and all of that to make it look like I had attacked her. What followed were probably the most surreal and frightening minutes of my life. I don't blame anyone for how they reacted, because in 1 second, the office was quiet and productive. In the next, there was a young woman with blood dripping onto her blouse, screaming that she had been attacked and needed help. The last thing anyone would have done in that situation was to stop her and ask, "Did this man really attack you, or are you a dangerously unbalanced person who faked a serious assault to save your job?" People did the only thing they could think of, which was to comfort her, provide medical assistance, and move me away while they called the police. No one tried to restrain me or anything, but I could see in people's eyes that they were shocked by the idea that I had attacked Tanya. It was our CEO who, in the middle of a complete mess, told me I should leave for the day. Then, on the way out, he told me I should probably get a lawyer or something, because God knows things would probably become very legally difficult for me. But I only had one thing to say: check the cameras. I promise you I didn't do anything. Just check the cameras. I'm not sure if Tanya didn't know about the small camera in the storage room, or if she just forgot about it due to her minor breakdown or nervous crisis, but the entire incident was recorded on video. And all it took for the police officers to see the footage with our CEO and realize the truth of the incident. The CEO said he and the police officers watched the footage with their mouths open before declaring that there was no case against me at all. Tanya was fired, and all my colleagues were given the opportunity to watch the footage so they could see for themselves that I was innocent. And after that incident, I felt relieved. Some of my colleagues even came to my desk to tell me how sorry they were that they had believed I had attacked Tanya, and said they could never have imagined how crazy she turned out to be. As I said, I was incredibly angry at Tanya at the time and had all sorts of thoughts about suing her. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized a person must be truly crazy to try to fake a crime in that manner and to physically injure herself in the process. And besides the fact that civil lawsuits are basically useless, a lawsuit against Tanya might bring some short-term satisfaction when she actually needed help, and by help, I mean serious psychological treatment. If she had harmed me in any way, or if she had damaged my property, that would have been a completely different story. But she didn't. The only person she ended up harming was herself. So, with all that in mind, in the unlikely event that you're hearing this, Tanya, I forgive you. I've also done things in life that I regret, things I did when my emotions were running high, and for which I should have taken a moment to think before I did them. And I see you as any other human being. Nothing really bad happened to me, and I don't need an apology. In fact, I believe the best news I could get right now would be that you are well, maybe living in a different city or something, and that everything you were struggling with at the time is already resolved and over. You scared me, but I'm sure you scared many other people too. Your family, your friends, your boyfriend or girlfriend. Those are the people I think of when I remember that incident from 2021. I sincerely hope you're doing better, and I want to take this opportunity to thank you for a valuable lesson. Sometimes, even if we take them for granted, there are certain rules or practices that exist for a very good reason. And recently, I heard a phrase that really stuck with me. The rules, as they say, are written in music. Hello, my name is Lisa, and I've officially decided to write down the story of something I experienced at my first office job. When I started, I got to know all my colleagues. A guy named Marcus immediately stood out. Everyone was very nice to me, but Marcus simply ignored me and was then a bit rude and coarse when I approached him to introduce myself. People said he was like that with everyone and that I shouldn't worry. He came to work, did his job, and then went home without even sharing a good morning with the rest of us. I guess that was just his way. I still thought he was an idiot, but he was good at his job. And today, I prefer working with someone competent than with an incapable friend. But then came the day when Marcus started not being so good at his job anymore. He started coming in late, looked like he hadn't slept, and when he started regularly missing deadlines, management asked him if he wanted to take some time off to sort himself out. We never found out what was wrong with him, whether it was medical or something at home, but Marcus refused the time off and continued his poor performance. I heard rumors that something would happen with him, be it a meeting with the boss, a suspension, or even termination. But everything came to a head one morning. Marcus came to work drunk and smelled of liquor. The news that Marcus was drunk spread through the office like wildfire, and we were all just waiting for something to happen. Finally, one of the bosses went out to talk to him. I don't know exactly what she said to him, but Marcus responded by yelling, "Let me do my damn job!" And then, without another word, she turned around, went back into her office, and closed the door. A minute later, the big boss, a bulky guy in his 50s, came out and gave Marcus what he deserved, telling him that if he didn't immediately take a taxi home, emphasis on the taxi, he would be fired immediately. Marcus began to curse at the boss, calling him all sorts of things I'd rather not repeat. Then, after announcing that he would call the police, our boss went back into his office. I hate to say it, but we sounded a little terrible. Everyone in the office was completely fascinated. Someone was having a complete breakdown right in front of us, And as sad and unsettling as it was, we were all completely glued to it. And somehow, I also felt sorry for Marcus. I don't think anyone in the office enjoyed what was happening, but Marcus was drunk and also sounded very angry. With the chances that things could escalate so high, I guess that's what kept us all attentive. Anyway, our big boss only came out of his office one more time to warn Marcus that the police were on their way, but Marcus just told him to go to hell. Then, maybe 20 or 30 minutes later, the police officers arrived and asked Marcus to leave. At this point, we were all watching. All the bosses had come out of their offices. Everyone was standing on their cubicles. We had turned our chairs sideways, all to see poor Marcus being thrown out or possibly arrested. Someone, I didn't see who, but it was one of my colleagues, yelled, "Just go, buddy! Get help!" Not even derogatorily. They meant it sincerely, I believe. And Marcus responded by yelling something back, and that's when the police officers decided he should be arrested. One of them began shouting, "Get up and put your hands behind your back," while the other prepared to handcuff him. But he still refused to move, constantly telling them to go to hell. And that's when the real fight began. One of the police officers tried to grab Marcus's arms, and he pushed them away generally. Then the other police officer intervened, and both tried to restrain Marcus when he suddenly turned and twisted, and all you heard was one of the police officers shouting, "He's got a gun! He's got a gun!" Someone, and I don't know who, but it was one of my colleagues, shouted, "Everyone on the floor!" And that's what we did. Almost instinctively, we all threw ourselves onto the floor as quickly as possible, and I remember praying not to hear a shot until I heard 3 loud bangs. This might sound strange to some Americans and non-Americans alike, but I had never heard a gunshot until that day, and let me tell you, it's something I never want to experience that closely again.
I believe it might have been the enclosed space of the office. Not that enclosed, but you get what I mean. Combined with my fear that made the bang seem so loud. But it was definitely the second most frightening thing I've ever experienced. But then, the most frightening thing was what I saw when I finally got up. I assume one of the police officers panicked, and instead of helping to remove Marcus's hand from the other officer's gun, he simply drew his own and shot him 3 times in the back. I didn't see it at first. I just heard screams and a woman shouting, "Oh my God, oh my God," before bursting into tears and having to be taken away. I stayed down at first, thinking maybe it was Marcus who had shot. But then, when I heard the 2 police officers talking to each other, I finally stood up and made the mistake of looking in their direction. And there was so much blood. I never thought a person could bleed so much and still be alive, but he was. Marcus had somehow managed to survive after being shot 3 times at close range. And seeing him move and try to breathe gave some people hope. The police officer who had shot him came out of the office, sobbing, saying, "He had your gun. I swear to God, he almost had your gun." Sometime afterward, when they had stabilized him and the emergency services arrived, they placed Marcus on a stretcher and took him to the waiting ambulance outside. The rest of the workday was canceled, and we found out that evening that Marcus had actually died on the way to the hospital. It was devastating. I didn't even know Marcus that well. I didn't even particularly like him. But hearing that he had died was just so incredibly disheartening for me and for everyone who had worked with him. The office remained closed for the entire week. But even when my colleagues started coming back during the month or so that followed, some took longer than others. I just couldn't bring myself to return to a place where someone had been murdered. I think what really bothers me is that some people get shot by the police after committing a crime or doing something that puts people in danger in some way, and others get shot because there's hardly any reason for it, or so I hear. But Marcus was just shot because he was having a bad day. I know it was because of the police officer's gun, I assume, and some of my colleagues really saw him reach for it. I'm just saying he didn't have to die like that.
I don't know what I would have done in that situation, or rather, I do know, but just hitting him could have resulted in Marcus getting the police officer's gun, and then who knows what would have happened. Some of us might even have been killed if there had been an exchange of gunfire. And I just wish things didn't have to be that way. And I know that probably sounds incredibly naive, but sometimes I really wonder if, had I given Marcus a big hug that morning, things might have been a little different. I used to do deliveries to about 20 or 30 office buildings all over Germany. I delivered to the same places week after week for almost 3 years, which meant I got to know some people there quite well. There was this guy, a few years older than me, who always came out to receive deliveries at a specific building. We chatted a bit here and there, and that's how I found out he played Xbox, specifically a game called Battlefield 1. For those who don't know, Battlefield 1 is a shooter game where you play in teams, and the better your team communicates and works together, the more effective you are and the more fun you have. So I got this guy's gamer tag, and a friend and I then linked up with him and his friends to play a few rounds of Conquest. We didn't play with those people every night, just occasionally when we weren't playing PUBG, which had just come out on console at the time. But it was nice to see him online too, besides the offline contact, and since then we were pretty friendly with each other. And so, in the summer of 2018, I drove to my gaming friend's office building to make a regular delivery, but found the place closed. Not closed with no one around and no cars in the parking lot. The place seemed open, but the doors were locked, and there were many police cars outside. I stopped, jumped out of my express van, and then went to the door to ask the police officers what was going on. One seemed genuinely calm and told me he really didn't know, that he was just told to keep an eye on the main entrance and that all employees had gone home for the day. I thanked him for the information and just continued my deliveries. But when I got home that evening and turned on my Xbox, my office friend was playing Battlefield 1 with his friends. I joined their group chat to ask him if everything was all right. I didn't know if there had been a fire, maybe a gas leak, or God forbid, some kind of lockdown or active shooter situation, so I was really concerned to make sure everything was okay. It turned out everything was fine, but when I asked the question, his friends started laughing a little and said, "Man, have I got a story for you." It was a story he had already told his two friends in the group chat, but he didn't mind telling it to me again while we played some games. So, my Battlefield 1 friend said he was working on something on his computer in one of the offices that morning when his computer suddenly froze. He said the computers were a bit slow and outdated, so it wasn't unusual for them to have problems from time to time, but while he was waiting for it to normalize before trying to fix the light, he heard his colleague in the next cubicle complaining about the faulty hardware they had to deal with. My friend got up and looked over the small cubicle wall and asked his colleague if his computer had frozen too, but it wasn't just his. All the computers in the office had suddenly hung up. Then, after a few minutes of total confusion, all the computer screens turned blue, and before anyone had time to react, the power went out throughout the office. Something had tripped the switch in the basement, so it didn't seem to be just a matter of the caretaker turning it back on or something. The whole place had had a surge or something. So, when the power came back, everyone turned their computers back on and started working again. But as they did, every computer began running a strange startup sequence, like when you turn on your computer and it seemed like something was being downloaded or installed. The whole time, no one could do anything else but turn off the computers. They weren't responding to any input. But since most people assumed it was some kind of update or the computers were fixing themselves or something, no one thought to do anything other than inform the company's HR guy. In the meantime, their HR guy was going crazy, and it took a while for them to realize the extent of the problem since their office was separate from the other cubicles. But when they realized that every computer in the building seemed to be installing some strange and unknown software, he started running around telling everyone to unplug their computers from the socket and stop installing anything extra. There was total confusion for a while. No one knew what to do. And finally, my friend's boss came out and told everyone to take an early lunch break. None of the computers in the cafeteria were working, so no one could pay for their lunch there. So everyone started looking for food outside. But then, during that next hour, some police officers showed up, and when my friend and his colleagues returned to work, they told them the place was closed for the day so they could investigate what had happened with the computers. It was an interesting story, not the most amazing thing I've ever heard, but my friend seemed to enjoy having a paid day off, and we spent the next few rounds of Xbox speculating about what might have happened, whether it was a denial of service attack, malware, or something else. Anyway, the week passed, and on my day off, I noticed that my office friend from Battlefield was online, but in the middle of the day. I asked him if he had returned to work, and he said no, that no one had returned to work yet. And not only that, but guess who had called him on his cell phone just a few hours earlier? An agent from the BKA. This agent sounded almost strangely friendly, considering what he was told to do, which was to call every employee of the company to talk to them about the day the computers went crazy. The agent asked my friend many questions, and many of them were strange and involved tiny details about his day. He just said he answered as honestly as possible because he wanted to help and had nothing to hide. That was the last he heard about it until his office reopened and he returned to work and everything seemed fine with the computer system. Apparently, many engineers had come in over the weekend to check their systems for viruses. But I'm no computer specialist, so I'm sure someone can explain that a little better than I can. The point is, they didn't find anything. The place seemed clean, so all employees were invited back, and everything continued as usual. But then, when my friend returned, he noticed that not all employees had returned, and one guy's desk was remarkably empty. Everyone was curious about where this guy was, and that curiosity intensified when my friend and his colleagues found out he had been suspended. Management didn't want to say why they had suspended him, but everyone rightly assumed it had something to do with the power outage and the computer freeze. People were told it was a private matter and that they should respect it. But as soon as he had the chance, my friend called the guy who had been suspended and asked what the hell was going on. And this is where it gets really weird. The guy who had been suspended said he hadn't just received a 30-day suspension, but that he had actually been arrested and questioned twice by BKA agents. In summary, both the company's management and the BKA believed he had something to do with blocking their computer system, and until recently, he was their sole suspect. My friend asked him how they had figured him out, and the guy said it all somehow related to a QR code sticker he found in the dumpster behind the office. Apparently, the place was smoke-free, and that also applied to e-cigarettes. But instead of going completely outside to get his nicotine fix, there was a tacit agreement that people could go to the dumpster as long as they weren't seen by the bosses. Anyway, the suspended guy goes to the back to use his vaporizer and sees the QR code stuck on the dumpster. And then, out of sheer curiosity, the guy takes out his phone and scans the code, then waits to see what appears in his internet browser. This little browser window opens, but nothing loads, and the guy realizes his phone is somehow in airplane mode or something, and that the internet has been deactivated. He goes to his settings, turns it back on, connects to the office Wi-Fi, and then, at that exact moment, bingo! All the computers in the office start hanging up. I assumed the engineers tracked what had infected the office computers all the way back to the guy's phone, and as soon as they figured it out, they slapped him with both the suspension and the 2 visits from the BKA agents. It was only after he handed over all his belongings, his phone, his computer, almost everything that could connect to the internet, and explained everything about the QR code he had found, that the BKA's attention turned to whoever had placed the QR code there, and he was no longer their sole suspect.
The guy said he was scared, even though he knew he hadn't done anything wrong, that he would be blamed for some major cyber attack and end up spending 100 years in federal prison after being falsely labeled a cyber terrorist or something. And I think that's the scary part of the story. A few days off work is the furthest thing from scary I can imagine. So, apart from the suspended guy, of course, he had it pretty easy. But this guy, man, I've scanned many QR codes on the street for all sorts of different reasons. I scanned one and saw a girl's art page, and another showed me a marijuana delivery service. And I wouldn't think twice about scanning a random one just to see what appears. But to think that could lead to me being hauled off by BK agents is enough to scare anyone. I live and work just outside of ST in a place called San Rafael, and like all offices in the country, we started working from home in April 2020. By April of the next year, there were still all sorts of rules for crowds and distances, and some team members continued to work from home, but the vast majority of us returned to the office because of all the associated benefits: free lunches, hot drinks, lower utility bills at home, and, well, to graze. In short, it was our second week back in the office, around 11:30 in the morning, and I was sitting at my desk trying to finish something before heading to the canteen for lunch. My desk is on the exterior wall of the office, which has long windows, and I was working when something caught my attention right outside the window. I looked over and saw it was one of those small drones just hovering in the air. I pointed it out to my colleague, and it was she who noticed the small camera attached to it. That's when we realized someone was outside using it to film or take photos of us. One by one, everyone in the office noticed the small drone, and after flying back and forth for a while, it suddenly disappeared from sight. Our manager came out of his office to see what was going on, and when we told him we were pretty sure someone had used their drone to spy on the office, he announced that he would go down to security to talk to them about it. Gradually, everyone returned to their work, and we spent the last hour before lunch. Everyone went down to the canteen to get something to eat. An hour later, when we all returned from lunch, our office manager told us that security had found a guy outside the complex who was apparently responsible for the drone. We work in a kind of industrial complex with several other offices and businesses, but there was a guy at the gate checking IDs to ensure only personnel entered the complex. He had denied access to the guy with the drone after finding out he didn't have any identification, but instead he had simply driven a little further down the road, parked his car, and then came out to fly his drone over the fence. Security then received messages about the drone, found out the guy had parked a little way down the road, and then went over to tell him to leave. But the guy refused. He claimed the right to fly his drone over private property and told security to call the police if they wanted him to leave. Shortly thereafter, our office manager informed us of the situation, saying that security was waiting for the police to ask the guy to leave. Apparently, he was still flying his drone around the complex, but if he reappeared at our windows, we were told to ignore him and try to continue with our work. We didn't see the drone again for the rest of the day, but the next morning, as I was on my way to work, I saw the guy's car parked a little way down the road and could see him leaning against it, watching everyone who entered the complex. Then, just an hour before our lunch break, the drone reappeared at the window and began hovering back and forth, watching us or taking photos, just like the day before. Everyone gradually noticed the drone, and our office manager came to see what was going on. In short, on this second day, the police came for the second time to ask the drone guy to leave, and the security guard from the main entrance accompanied them to hear what was said. At first, the drone guy claimed he was an auditor who had come to inspect the property. That sounded somewhat legitimate at first, so both the police and our security guard thought he might actually be in some capacity. So they asked him to show his identification papers. In response, the man began to say, "I don't have to show you my identification papers. I'm an auditor, and I have the right to be here, and that's all you need to know."
The police then said that was fine. He didn't have to show them anything, but could he at least tell them what company he was from or what he was doing so that we could be reassured in the offices? Our security guard said the police were absolutely polite and just asked a few harmless questions, but all they got was hostility. Not too aggressive, it's true. The man simply refused to answer any questions and continued to say, "I'm an auditor and I have the right to be here." According to what our security guard heard, the auditor had broken no law by flying his drone around our office building.
It wasn't trespassing. I suppose he was technically right about that. But the police told him that if he repeatedly used the drone to take photos of us, that would eventually be considered harassment, and they would arrest and charge him if we decided to file a complaint. For those of you who were as confused as I was about this whole interaction, and wow, I was confused, here's some background information you need to know so it all makes a little more sense. There is a very peculiar type of person in this world, and what they like to do is go to different places and just film people or take photos of the people who are there. And this also exists in almost all of Mexico and in other countries too. Only their people call themselves First Amendment auditors, and there are tons of videos of them online, arguing with strangers, sometimes being attacked, and sometimes being arrested when they try to enter courtrooms or military bases, places where they basically aren't allowed to be. And personally, I find all of this completely absurd, and the only thing I can think of is that these people have too much free time and somehow thrive on negative interactions with other people. It's weird, really weird, but these people will exist, and this guy was one of them. We were aware of all this for the third day, so everything made a little more sense to us. The only real question at that point was why the hell he was auditing us of all people. One of my office colleagues, a guy named Fernando, was the one who told us about these crazy First Amendment auditors in America, or whatever they want to call it, and he told us that, in his opinion, the sooner we completely ignored the drone guy, the faster he would leave. You see, many of these strange auditors think that if they get even the slightest resistance or rejection from the people they film, that must mean those people are doing something evil. But no one wants to be photographed randomly, right? It all feels a little personal. So I imagine this guy thought everyone was doing something evil if he just walked around provocatively filming people. My point is that Fernando said the sooner we denied the auditor that satisfaction and started ignoring the guy, the faster he would get out of our hair and stop bothering someone else. In short, that worked, and in the end, our office manager officially filed a harassment complaint with the police, claiming he was preventing us from working effectively. It was a bit exaggerated on his part, but it definitely wasn't pleasant to know he was watching us through that little camera in the drone. The day after the harassment complaint was filed, we were all waiting at 11:30 to see if the drone would reappear at the window. And when it was 11:45 and no appearance occurred, some of us made a little noise to celebrate that the boring little saga was finally over. But it wasn't over yet. We still had a long way to go before that happened. So, on that day, the drone didn't appear. That was a Thursday. But then the next morning on the way to work, I noticed someone standing outside the front door filming everyone who entered the industrial complex on his cell phone. As I got closer, I recognized him. It was the strange auditor, but this time he didn't have a drone. But he was still there as I approached the complex, and the security guard at the gate let me in. I could see the auditor guy filming me with his cell phone, not just my car, but he held his phone at stomach level and tried to film my face as I stopped to raise the barrier. As I mentioned before, it was deeply unpleasant, but all he was doing was taking photos of us. What I wanted to know more than anything was why he was doing it. I remember discussing this with some of my colleagues that day, but none of us could come to a definitive answer. Even our office manager, who was in regular contact with security at the time, said they had no idea why he was taking photos of people. Every time they asked him, he just said, "That's none of your business," or something similar. And everything else just made him say, "Call the police."
Then, I learned later that day that the police had removed him. They gave him some kind of order that meant they could arrest him if he didn't leave, and so he left, only to return a few days later when we all came back to work on Monday morning. When I saw him this time, my curiosity probably overwhelmed me. I had always been a little suspicious of the guy, not really scared, but definitely not willing to approach him in any way. But that Monday, my curiosity completely overwhelmed me, and while I waited for the barrier to go up, I rolled down the passenger side window and shouted for him to come over. The first thing he did was film me by simply holding his phone out of the opened window, probably to get a better picture of me. That didn't particularly bother me at that moment, as he had already photographed me dozens of times. But I took the opportunity to ask him why he was so determined to waste his time at our industrial complex. I'll never forget how he asked, "Excuse me? What nonsense are you talking about? I didn't quite catch that." And when I repeated myself, he lowered the phone to make eye contact with me and said, "I know what you're doing inside, and when I have proof of it, you'll be in trouble. Mark my words." Just so you know, our company was a marketing firm specializing in graphics and logos. A small company might contact us, ask us to prepare a portfolio of potential branding ideas, and then pay a flat fee for our time, our experience, and the rights to use all the designs our art department created. As far as I knew, the other businesses in the complex were a warehouse that rented containers to the public, a company that sold ink cartridges, and then 2 consulting firms that I'm almost certain specialized in IT. Everything was very innocent and quite boring, to be honest, so it made no sense for the auditor to tell me, "You'll be in trouble." I asked him what he meant, or rather what he thought we were doing there, and he replied and said, "You'll tell me, sweetie, you'll tell me," in the most absurd way imaginable. I told him to leave, closed the window again, and then drove off to park my car in my office parking lot. That day, I mentioned the strange interaction to some of my colleagues, focusing mainly on the comment that we were doing something wrong, or at least something we would get in trouble for. I mean, what the hell did he think we were doing if we weren't creating marketing and branding portfolios all day long? I knew he probably wasn't all there, so I thought there wasn't much logic in what he had to say. And a comment he made to another colleague made even less sense. Joanne from the copyright department said that when she told him what we did, namely that we were a marketing consulting firm, he replied, "You know as well as I do that it doesn't matter what happens upstairs, but what happens downstairs." Or did he mean the ground floor? It had to be that. We didn't have a basement, but the ground floor was reception, conference rooms, the cafeteria, things like that. Nothing in any way strange or inappropriate. Anyway, the police continued to come to kick him out, but until we had a court order explicitly preventing him from entering the premises, we had to endure him showing up every morning, only to be kicked out like clockwork when the police managed to come by. We couldn't wait for that restraining order to be signed by a judge, but we had no idea that the situation would resolve itself in a terrible way in just 2 weeks. The next week, we simply endured the auditor being outside. Sometimes he even had a friend with him, a guy with badges on a coat that read "No to 5G." At least it seemed to be painted like that. As I said, I didn't see him over the next weekend, of course, but early Monday morning, he was back outside the facilities, his cell phone in hand. You really have to admire his dedication. He was always there, even when it was pouring rain, just an umbrella in one hand and his phone in the other, making sure he didn't miss a day. And then finally, one Wednesday morning, our manager came out of his office to share some good news with us. Craig Parkhill, a guy we called Jose Antonio, was supposed to return to the office after his old vaccinations. Jose Antonio was quite sick at the time and had chosen to work from home until everything was back to normal, so it was a big morale boost for all of us to hear that he was well enough to come back to the office. But then we wondered how Jose Antonio would react when he saw the auditor at the front door. And all we had done was ask the auditor why he was so happy to waste his time, but we had never been that confrontational. But Jose Antonio was probably not the type to pass by more than 2 or 3 times without giving the guy a good dressing down, and honestly, we were all pretty excited about it. The policy was, let security handle it, don't interact with him, and we tried to stick to the plan as best as possible. But Jose Antonio was not the type to stick to the plan. He always chose the most direct path from A to B, without detours or nonsense, and how he would deal with the auditor might be very different from the approach we had taken. Anyway, next Monday, Jose Antonio was supposed to return to work. He always came a little early to have breakfast in the cafeteria, another advantage of the job. So I arrived about 20 minutes before Jose Antonio arrived. I remember telling you that my desk had a view out the window. Well, the view had a few trees, so it was quite nice when you were sitting, but when you stood up, you had a great view of the parking lot. I couldn't see the front door from the window, but I could see the driveway to our parking lot, which meant I could see when Jose Antonio's car rounded the corner and entered our parking lot. Excuse me if that's a little confusing, but then, right behind Jose Antonio's car, which drove almost the whole way, was the stranger, the auditor. As far as I knew, he had never tried to enter the complex, and it seemed like he was angry as he chased Jose Antonio's car. So I immediately thought, damn, something's going on at the front door. Maybe Jose Antonio is shouting at him, but I couldn't be sure. So I waited until Jose Antonio got out of his car and headed towards the main entrance to go to the window, which meant I could see the front door. The line of sight wasn't perfect, but I could see enough to see Jose Antonio standing there in front of the front door with such a grim expression on his face that truly surprised me. I hadn't realized how serious the situation was until that moment, and the security guard seemed just as worried. I asked Jose Antonio if everything was okay, and he just looked at me with wide eyes as if he had seen something terrible. I moved a little closer and asked him if he wanted to go home or something, but he just shook his head and then said, "No, I'm fine. I'm perfectly fine." But I wasn't convinced that was true. Although he didn't say any more, I stayed with him for a few minutes to make sure he was okay, and then returned to my desk to start my workday. My work was nothing special, as I said, but these morning interactions always took you out of the flow of things a little, and you could spend the whole morning thinking about what would have happened if you had done something differently. These questions always stay in your head, no matter how much you try to forget them, and the only way to get rid of them is to discuss them with your colleagues. So I did that. It was one of the craziest weeks in the office, with the auditor showing up every morning, and then Jose Antonio returning and being followed by the auditor on the same morning he returned. We all had many questions, but no one had many answers. It was obvious that the auditor was taking photos of us, and probably Jose Antonio too, but there was no way of knowing why he was doing it. Then, at 9 in the morning, we had a conversation with the police, and they told us we could call them immediately if the auditor showed up again and did anything even remotely threatening, and they would detain him for harassment. That wasn't a comforting thought. I mean, couldn't he have done that from the beginning if he had really planned it? So we suddenly felt like we were on borrowed time. We had a little more than a week before everything was over, but there was really no way of knowing when it would end. It was as if we were all waiting for the auditor to just get bored, give up, and leave. But how could we be sure? We just had to keep going and hope for the best. There was a strange mood in the office that day. Everyone was talking as usual, but no one seemed truly present. We were probably all thinking the same thing, and it was hard to concentrate on work when you knew the auditor could be outside at any moment, filming everything we did. And nothing zaps your motivation faster than knowing someone is watching everything you do. Anyway, it was a long day. We left the office around 6:30 in the evening as usual, and when I got home, I just collapsed onto the couch and turned on the TV. I didn't want to think about work. Not about the auditor. Not about anything. I wanted to forget everything and just relax. That was the only thing I truly needed at that moment. After this week full of tension in the office, the weekend finally arrived. It was a welcome relief for everyone, although we couldn't stop ourselves from wondering what would happen when we returned on Monday. Would the auditor continue to show up outside? Would more incidents follow? There was no way to know. On Monday morning, I arrived at the office with some apprehension. There was something in the air suggesting the situation was reaching a critical point. When I entered, I noticed my colleagues had nervous expressions. Some were even whispering softly, exchanging theories about what might happen next. To my surprise, the auditor wasn't outside when I arrived. That was a momentary relief, but also a cause for concern. Had he finally decided to abandon his strange crusade, or was he planning something new? During the morning, the tension in the office was palpable. We were all working, but our minds were elsewhere. Every time someone went to the window, the murmurs started again, speculating about the auditor's whereabouts and what he was up to. Then, around noon, we received news that left us speechless. The police had found the auditor in a nearby park in a state of confusion and agitation. He was arrested for disturbing the peace and was taken to a psychiatric health center. The news was a shock to all of us. Despite everything that had happened, we had never thought the situation would come to this extreme. We were relieved that he had finally been detained, but also concerned for his well-being. As the day progressed, the tension in the office began to subside. With the auditor out of the picture, we could finally focus on our work again. However, the experience left a feeling of unease that lingered long afterward. Over time, life in the office returned to normal. The incident with the auditor became an anecdote told to new employees, but we never forgot what we had gone through during those weeks of uncertainty. And so, life continued, with its ups and downs and its moments of calm. But the experience with the auditor left us with an important lesson. Never underestimate the power of unpredictable human behavior. I worked as a night watchman in a residential building in the city center. The housing association had many security concerns due to the way the building was constructed in the late 60s. Both parking decks were accessible from the street level, meaning there were many possible entry points, many of which were obscured from the security camera system. For this reason, I had to do 2 rounds of the entire building during my shift to ensure no non-resident had found their way inside. The biggest problem we had were occasional car thefts, but what I most often found were homeless people who had found their way into the parking deck and curled up in a corner to seek some shelter. Moving them off the street was by far the most unpleasant part of my job, but I had to do it. After working there for several months, I knew all the places where they usually hid. The building was very old and had undergone many renovations in its life, creating many nooks and crannies, unnecessary concrete projections, sealed rooms, and corridors and stairs that led nowhere. The creepiest place in the whole building was so strange and potentially dangerous that I took a photo of it and showed it to management. On the first level of the parking deck, there was a door leading to a corridor directly under the ramp to the second parking deck level. It was about 1.5 to 2 meters wide and stretched about 6 to 9 meters, yet it led nowhere. At the end was a large water pipe with a valve, which was the only reason for the room. But in the dark, with only a faint flashlight, that pipe seemed to take on many other shapes. However, what made it dangerous was the lock on the door. There was no lock or bolt on one side, but on the outside there was a large sliding bolt. There was only one way in or out, and it was locked from the outside without the possibility of opening it from the inside. Since I discovered the place, I couldn't help but imagine how easy it would be for someone to be trapped there. Yet, nothing I told management made a difference. They were already informed and had no intention of doing anything about it. Unfortunately, that meant I had to open and check the door every night, but I never entered that place. I was too afraid. Months went by like this, and then, one day, my worst nightmare came true. It was around 3 in the morning, in the middle of my shift. I was doing my rounds on the parking deck, and everything was normal. It was a quiet Wednesday night, there were no problems or suspicious activities on the cameras, so I was pretty relaxed. But at some point, I was forced to pay attention. I heard the sound of a door slamming shut on the other side of the parking deck. I wasn't sure where it came from, so I walked over to investigate. My heart sank a little when I saw that the door to the dead-end corridor was wide open. I looked around to see if anyone was on the parking deck, but it seemed empty. I called out to scare off anyone who was hiding, but I got no answer, and no one appeared. I was only worried that someone was hiding in the dead end, so I walked over. I illuminated the corridor with my flashlight and felt relieved for a moment when I saw that no one was there. However, there was an empty glass bottle about 3 meters in. I sighed and rolled my eyes, thinking someone had been drinking there and quickly ran away when they saw me snooping around, accidentally making noise while running. It wouldn't have been difficult for someone to climb over the parked cars and jump over the fence onto the neighboring parking deck if I got there, as the garage was partially underground at that point. That was actually a common entry point, because the dead-end corridor was in a prominent camera blind spot. Unfortunately, I wasn't allowed to leave trash anywhere if I saw it, so I knew I had to pick up that bottle. Of course, I felt the fear boiling up inside me, just because I had to take a few steps into that corridor. I almost didn't do it, but I rationalized that there was no way someone would come out and lock me in. I took a deep breath and went inside, but just as I reached the bottle, the door slammed shut. I immediately ran to the door, but when I got there, it was already locked. I started banging on the door and shouting for help, but no one was there. I felt like I was being buried alive. I could barely breathe. If I hadn't had a flashlight, I would have been in deep trouble.
I wouldn't have been able to see anything. As soon as I realized I wouldn't be getting out soon, I reached for my phone. To my horror, however, I had no signal at all. The walls were made of concrete blocks, and the door was metal. Plus, the entire 6-story building was above me. No matter what I tried, I couldn't connect to emergency services. There was absolutely nothing I could do. I was completely trapped. The only way out would be if someone opened the door from the outside. But it was 3 in the morning, and it would be hours before someone came to work in the morning. And during that time, whoever had locked me in would do whatever they wanted on the parking deck. I heard several car alarms going off and knew what was happening. Somehow, they were all turned off after a few minutes. I kept banging on the door and shouting, but no one came. After a while, if I'm being completely honest, I lost hope that I would be free anytime soon and focused on staying calm. I sat down against the wall and turned off my flashlight to save battery, but only after making sure I was completely alone. Every few minutes, I would knock on the door several times. It took about 2 hours, but I finally managed to get the attention of someone who was going to work early in the morning. I thanked him when he let me out, but unfortunately, the next thing I had to do was call the police because I quickly noticed that dozens of cars had been damaged. There was broken glass everywhere on the parking deck from all the windows that had been smashed.
Whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing. They knew how to lock me in there, and they knew how to silence the car alarms. We only had security personnel on weekends, and that made us vulnerable on a seemingly harmless Wednesday. In total, tens of thousands of dollars in damage and theft occurred, and I was fired from my job. Not that I wanted to go back anyway. The perpetrator was never identified on the cameras, and never was.